So, would you please join in? Session 4 will be devoted to global trade and whether the codes and regulations ensure fair pricing. Let us get started. The time is running, so the others are going to join us later. We are starting session 4. Whether the codes and regulations ensure fair pricing. The first speaker will be Mrs. Bernadetta Kasztelan-Świetlik of Gesell & Partners Law Firm. The Polish Act on Unfair Trading Practices has been drawn up in 2016 and has entered into effect in 2017, and it's still effective. And the presentation will be devoted to this piece of legislation. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank for inviting me to participate in the forum. I'm really impressed by the event last night, and I'm happy to speak after a coffee break. I'm a lawyer by profession, and people used to call lawyers those whose main feature is to be boring, so I hope I will not take too much of your time. I will speak about the solutions for fair trade and how those solutions work here in Poland. Let us start with a bit of history. The issue is not a new one. It tackles Polish companies, Polish entrepreneurs. It's been an issue for them for over 10 years. The cases related to unfair trading practices were in the past resolved by common courts, which were quite willing to resolve such cases. However, entrepreneurs complained of the lengthiness of the proceedings and the fact that before the court judgment is issued, many of them are at the verge of bankruptcy. Therefore, the Office for the Protection of Consumers, for Consumer and Competition Protection, as well as other organizations, started to think of how they could regulate trade practices, including in the area of dairy products, where both the supply and price depend on factors such as weather that is beyond the influence of anyone indeed. Those aspects, those attempts to regulate the area were discussed in the parliament, and first attempts to self-regulate the sector were taken. In 2015, we were just about to adopt a code of good practices. Mrs. Agnieszka Maliszewska was strongly engaged in the project, and the project did not get finalized. And at the Office for Consumer and Competition Protection, I used to emphasize that either you regulate your sector yourselves, or this will be done by the legislator. Finally, in 2016, the Act, which has a very long title, was adopted. I will call it on trade advantages, and its scope was limited to agri-food products, although the unfair trading practices relate obviously to all kinds of products. In order to prevent the flooding with small-scale cases, a requirement was introduced for the consideration of the cases under the Act. The requirement was introduced for the company to have a turnover of about 50,000 Polish zlotys and to have a contractual advantage. And what is of greatest importance for the consumers was that if the act is broken, is violated, a penalty of 3% of turnover can be imposed, and the turnover is taken into account for the year preceding the imposition of the penalty. Every entrepreneur operating in the market wants to find out what they can do and what they are not allowed to do. If the office tells that specific practices are against the law, those interpreters would change their behavior. So in the act, an attempt was taken to introduce a general clause determining which specific practices are considered unfair practices. And on the other hand, steps were taken to combat those practices. So 4 main practices considered unfair in the field of trading are listed here. The most frequent one is unjustified termination of an agreement or threatening the company with the termination of the agreement that has been concluded with it. The Act was amended in 2018 by a review of what the Act has given, what benefits had there been of the Act for the market, and the legal considerations were focused on the following items. First of all, we focused on abolishing the thresholds of the turnover of the individual companies filing claims under the Act. As I mentioned initially, those thresholds existed, then they were abolished. Also, contractual advantage was redefined, and entrepreneurs wanted their cases to remain anonymous so that the complainant remains anonymous, cannot be identified, because they were afraid of the negative impacts of their of filing the cases. A little bit of statistics. The Office for Consumer and Competition Protection in 2018, when the Act entered into force, started to consider the cases quite intensively. At the beginning, there was a consensus that there were penalties imposed on the entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs had to get used to how to operate under the new regulation. A huge number was of so-called soft level calls or motions were sent to those companies, which were letters calling them to take specific action. The company is not under any legal obligation to take the measures suggested in the letter. However, he is informed whether such specific activities can bear responsibility of, on his side, the efficiency of those soft requirements, soft calls for action are very popular with the companies because they want to eliminate the practices from the market. However, the companies do not perceive it as any formal threat. The first decision, as a result of which the penalty actually was not imposed, but an administrative requirement was introduced due to the lengthiness of the proceeding, the exchange of a lot of correspondence, a lot of data was received from the company. As you see, so you see the numbers of cases, 55 soft letters, explanatory cases 11, 26 soft notifications. But later on, the office started to impose penalties, hard penalties, because in the initial period, the companies had the time to adjust to the new regulation. But there was a major penalty imposed on Jeronimo Martens, over 700 million Polish zlotys. The penalty was imposed on Jeronimo Martens for the use of discounts that were inconsistent with the law, and producers who were supplying their products to be sold within the Biedronka network of retail stores, they were really not sure at what price their products will finally be bought. Actually, across the European Union, individual countries, the situation looked similar. The practices between suppliers and buyers caused a lot of concern. There was research conducted on this issue, and in 2013, a statement including recommended directions of action in this regard was issued, and yet the problem could not be resolved at the level of self-regulatory measures. There were suggestions that no directive is required in this field. However, there were no actions following. And starting from 2016, we have to remember this came into effect. However, our act is younger. So now what Poland needs to do is to implement certain solutions provided for in the directive on contractual advantage. The draft has already been accepted by the Council of Ministers of this act to implement those regulations in Poland. And last week, actually, the draft was submitted to the Parliament, and the Polish Act, when adopted, will implement the provisions of the European Union directive, those provisions that do not yet exist in the Polish law. The definition of agri-food products will be extended. The definition of buyer will also be extended also to public entities. The thresholds, turnover thresholds, will also be reintroduced. Those that were removed in 2018, and the procedure of a voluntary payment of penalty will be introduced as well. So if a company has a proceeding going with regard to him before the Office for Competition and Consumer Protection, the office may write a letter to the company that the penalty will be 100 million. But if the company declares that they would submit to the voluntary payment of a penalty amount. The amount may be lower by up to 50%. There was a general clause existing the violations of the law, and the European directive extends the catalogue by other examples, such as prohibited payment later than 30 days in the case of products that are not long-lasting, and over 60 days if the products are long-lasting. The Act applies solely to agri-food products, so the President of the Office for Competition and Consumer Protection will probably use this specific Act in relation to agri-food companies. Also, the Act will implement the European directive by adopting the individual provisions of this directive literally, and other provisions will also indicate practices that may be used by the parties, provided they have clearly and explicitly agreed those practices between them during the negotiations. Let me end this presentation of the draft act by saying that some act needed to be adopted, but my personal feeling has always been that it would be better for companies to resolve such issues within the code of good practices, which is less antagonizing between the parties. However, we have regulations on everything and anything now, so definitely we will not withdraw from this act, and good practice codes will not change anything at this stage. The Office for Competition and Consumer Protection has become, let me say, a warden supervisory body monitoring the compliance with the directive. Thank you very much for this information. So, should we regulate or should we not regulate? Are we not over-regulating the market? The next presentation related to the regulation, Mr. Adler, Vice President of Copa-Cogeca, will speak about how France has regulated the aspects of dairy sector. Good afternoon, everyone. I understand that the last night event was very pleasant. Unfortunately, myself, I just cannot remember anymore what was happening there at all. But let me start with thanking all the participants, primarily Agnieszka, for their hospitality, welcoming us so warmly. Agnieszka is a very professional person and a perfect dancer. I would also like to relate to agricultural cooperation in my presentation, obviously. And what does it look like in France? France is regulating its food chain, has regulated its food chain. We have an association which groups 2,500 cooperatives, which are grouped under an organization which is called La Coopération Agricole. Our task is to promote cooperatives. Cooperatives are extremely popular in France, and 40% of Agri-Food products are sold under the brands that are owned by cooperatives. Cooperatives have their own brands, this is what I mean, and those brands are very... The second aspect of activity of Coopération Agricole is of this organization. The second aspect of its work is lobbying. We are speaking with them to influence the situation, so that to well represent the interests of farmers and to represent well, to appropriately represent and reflect all those interests that can be later covered by legislative regulations. You have to remember that we are masters of the world in the amount of legal regulations that we have in our country. So when we implement some regulation, we have to do it in so as to well represent the interests of the members of those cooperatives. And the third aspect is to do it in line with the legislation. And here we also present what we do as cooperatives. We protect them, we also give them tools so that our cooperatives can be adjusting to the surrounding world. Cooperatives can have only 10 members or between 15 and 20,000 members. The smallest ones can have a turnover of 1 million euros per year. The largest ones have a turnover of 5 billion euros. I'm not sure I have... I have skipped some slide. Today we are considering how to regulate the trading practices. Let me say how it looked like in France. We have two main leverages to regulate the market. The previous speaker has related to it. We can regulate it through legislative acts, and we can also have self-regulation by individual organizations, and this balance is important. In France, we regulate by way of parliamentary acts, by law. This is a major area of regulation. We will discuss this in more detail later. And starting in 1985, up to now, we have been regulating the market. So here in the slide, you see the evolution of our regulations. The new ones come into force. And we have been speaking of competitiveness of enterprises as well. Continuous adjustment of regulations actually translates into limited competitiveness of companies. So many people in individual cooperatives actually have the task to follow the continuously changing regulations, so as to know how to operate. And here I have a slide that is all in French. I'm not sure if I can show the pointer. The light in the pointer is not working, but let me summarize what is presented there. Anytime we see a new piece of regulation, it has an impact at the sales, on the sales price, final price, and the price that is paid by the consumer. So we have to clarify to people that the increase in prices is not always due to an increase in to the more detailed regulation. For instance, there was an act which was accompanied by a sudden increase in prices. However, the increase was not the effect of the act. Right now we have a similar situation. We have an act whose name is EGalim. It was said to have caused an increase in prices, but actually the increase was not caused by the act, but by the situation related to the COVID limitations in trade. So what is the negotiation landscape in France? We have thousands of different players in the market, in the Agri-Food sector, and they negotiate with large retail sale companies, and everyone has to get through those distributors. And the small companies organized in an act that was adopted in 2005 that was aimed at modernizing the economy, and that act increased the negotiation power of retail sale companies. So as a result of this act, there was a drop in prices, which was good for consumers but was not good for food producers. The effect today is different. We are speaking about increasing prices, about getting the value back. So we first had to understand the results of the act, to understand that the retail chain is maybe too extensive, and there is tendency to go around, to bypass them. So there are short supply chains built nowadays. Of course, most of the production goes through this retail distributors chain, but not all of that. But they are still the strongest entities in the market. And here we see quite an interesting curve. There are the leading brands in red, and in green we have the networks such as Auchan. So, for instance, we know that Auchan is present also in Poland. So we can see there is a kind of price war ongoing in France right now between those two curves, which has resulted in a situation in which the brands owned by those retail sales develop more than other brands, although they have less value. And here we see another curve which is kind of problematic. This is the loss of profitability of agri-food sector companies as a result of the price war, and there is the trend of reducing the margins, and the profitability has decreased strongly, which has caused a situation in which companies do not have enough resources, enough money to invest in further development. They would want to invest, but let us imagine there is a company which owns certain machinery park, which owns certain tools that are even pose a risk to employees to use those tools. and they actually should be replaced with more modern tools, as they pose a risk for employees, but companies have no money to invest in replacing those old tools. As a result, the profits are lower, there is no innovation, and there is a kind of vicious circle which can lead to bankruptcy. So now people are becoming more aware, the industry is becoming more aware, and we now should generate an added value for everyone in the chain. So that's the spirit of the most recent parliamentary act, Egalim, which changes the system. And the spirit of this act is to change the situation. We, within our agricultural cooperatives, have been the main organization that claimed we have to stop this price war in France. We cannot continue decreasing the prices on the side of farmers. We started to lobby for the adoption of such an act. This was our main task, and we wanted the government to hear us and to find out about our position. And it happened. So what is the situation now? As a result of the adoption of the Egalim Act, in our value chain, we first of all regulate the individual parts of income that flows to producers, distributors, and retailers, so that everyone has a decent earning on their work. And the dairy sector as such has noted an increase in prices, which, however, has not been directly due to the act, but due to the because of the negotiations, as a result of which we could make up for the loss on the old prices that existed in the past. Not all of the expected results by this act have been achieved yet by this act, but the purpose was for every element in the supply chain, in the food chain, to have decent earning. This is not yet fully achieved. And the market, in fact, regulates it independently. It regulates the situation. We in France, we sometimes forget about some issues. And, well, we need regulations, we need legislation, we need framework legislation. But if legislation is too complicated and too detailed, too specific, and covers even tiny details, it's very difficult to companies to follow those, to actually implement the provisions of those regulations. So we have to protect the so-called intelligence of our organizations between. We have shifted, for instance, from producing milk and then regulating the prices of milk. Now we are focused more on consumer expectations. It is the consumers who expect something from the market. They expect retail chains to sell certain products, and according to this, the production is organized. We have very high quality requirements in terms of dairy products. And the dairy sector has to meet those very strict requirements. For instance, the level of antibiotics used in food production has been reduced very strongly. I'm not even mentioning organic products, but even in all other products, the level of antibiotics has to be extremely low. So we have to focus on that. Also in France, we eliminate the carbon print, and we want to focus on continuing to reduce the emission input into the agri-products. Of course, any legislation determines only the general direction of action, but the individual cooperatives have to follow those regulations in practice, have to implement the individual requirements. We also have to focus on not implementing the legislation without thought, without considerations. Here I have commented already, in fact, on the slide that is now displayed, the most recent act that has been introduced, because we have a new act coming into effect more or less every 2 years. The most recent act is under development, so there will be a new act introduced in the future, and there is some concern relating to the drafting of this act. Of course, it creates some framework for in order to end this pricing war in France, which is the main goal. But our concern is that this act is focused only on specific categories of products, not on all products. So there may be networks that will operate using the margins, and this will impact certain categories of products, which causes our concern. Now I would like to quite swiftly go through the elements of the situation in France, which will represent the statement of us as Coopération Agricole Cooperative. We may not represent the same vision, maybe as the farmers themselves, but it is similar in our visions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that was the French perspective. That is another example that a good regulatory law is in fact the legal framework, and later on it could be filled with the content and measures. Now other solutions, that is Germany. Friedman Kraft, agricultural counselor and Embassy of Germany in Warsaw. How did Germany regulate unfair trading practices in processing sector? I'm very happy, ladies and gentlemen, to be here with you today. And I'm here for the fourth time already, that is at this conference, at this forum. And I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to the conference. I'd like to thank you very much, especially Agnieszka.
Is to explain you, oh please, here's a pointer. Is to explain you how Germany has regulated unfair trade practices in the processing chain. Let me have a brief look in the beginning on the initial situation in Germany. 4 large retail chains, all well known to you, I guess, dominate 85% of the market, just to talk about Lidl and Aldi, for example. Farmers are at the bottom of the food chain after the processing industry, and the highly concentrated retail food sector which dictates the conditions. So the need for legislation in Germany is evident. Now I would like to show you the 2 sets of legal frameworks that we use in Germany to protect the supply chain or the farmers against unfair trade practices. We have on the left side the old, let's say, the general competition law, the German Gesetz gegen Wettbewerbsbeschränkung, the GWB in short, that is not directed as farmers as such, but of course also regulates the relation between suppliers, farmers or processors, and retailers. I would like to point at the 3 most relevant provisions here in this regard, which is Article 19, which stipulates a prohibition of the abuse of a dominant market power. This central provision has been interpreted by German courts in a very extensive way, so experts say we always had a quite high level of protection in Germany. Because it's a general clause and it covers most of the possible unfair trade practices. Moreover, I have to point at several privileges under antitrust law for producer companies and their association, as well as recognized producer organizations. These privileges allow producers to join forces and strengthen their bargain power in the food chain. These exemptions are in line with Regulation 1308/13. Last but not least, in Germany we have since a couple of years, we have a prohibition of selling below cost price. This is Article 20. It is important here to emphasize that this is only dedicated at suppliers with a superior market power. Nevertheless, I heard that in practice, this legal provision doesn't play any role. It was never really relevant in courts. So once again, I said that all these provisions have been always extensively interpreted by the highest German courts, so experts assume there is already a high level of protection, and the majority of existing unfair trade practices can already be addressed effectively and combated via the existing German general competition law. Therefore, the German Cartel Office, when we came to discuss about further provisions on a European level, they said, no, we don't need it. They spoke out against it. They said, we have enough regulation in Germany. The German government didn't follow this view and supported the new directive, which I will talk about in a minute, and implemented it into law. So to better protect farmers and downstream suppliers from unfair trading practices of stronger purchasers, from June this year, the most detrimental unfair trading practices have been banned in Germany. And that is thanks to this directive, which is presented here. The rules that transpose the directive into German law is it's called Law for Strengthening the Supply Chain in the Agricultural Sector, short version AGRA-OLKG. This law is transposing the directive. It specifically regulates the legal relationship between suppliers and buyers, whereas the general competition law I was talking about earlier is more focused on the legal relations between competing sellers. So what does the directive regulate? It makes use of 2 lists prohibitions. I will make that very shortly because my Polish colleague already talked about this. It has a so-called blacklist with a set of trade practices which will be completely prohibited per se in supply agreements between producer and buyer. This includes, as an example, cancellation of orders at short notice of perishable foodstuff. Then we have the so-called gray list, which contains other commercial practices that are only to be permitted after explicit agreement between the party. So although these practices are considered problematic, they may still be contractually agreed. Critics argue that these practices are usually not the result of an A-to-A negotiation on an equal level, but often involve a unilateral shifting of risk and cost to the weaker supplier. The directive has not resulted in full harmonization. It only contains a minimum standard. Article 9 of the directive allows member states to go beyond the minimum standard and to introduce stricter prohibitions. Some member states have done so. Germany is one of them. I will show what Germany has done. Talking about Poland, if I understand it right, Poland has not made use of this possibility. And we just heard that the law will come into force, the transposing law will come into force soon, obviously, but we have to mention also the deadline for transposition already passed in May, so let's say Poland is a little bit late, but okay. And I can only guess why Poland has not used this possibility of going beyond the minimum standard, but maybe, and I learned that from the presentation from the colleague, there is already, with the laws that you showed us, there is already quite a high level of protection, but it would be interesting to hear. So now let me explain what we regulated in the German law. In line with the UTP directive, that doesn't come as a surprise, the German law on strengthening the supply chain prohibits a range of practice while it allows other practices only if they have been clearly agreed upfront between supplier and the buyer. As regards specific points, and this is this slide here, the German law goes beyond the minimum standard, and it does so in taking trade practices of the gray list into the blacklist on national level. They are simply forbidden, even if agreed upon. And that is, the first one is the prohibition that the buyer may charge listing, payment for the stocking or listing of products. I think that's an important one. It's the last one here on my slide. The second one is that the buyer, when he returns unsold products to the supplier, he must pay the sale price and additionally the cost of disposal of those returned products which are perished. That, I heard, used to be a problem in Germany. If at the end of the day, the supplier had to take back the products that were not sold in the supermarket. Since this law just came into force in June of this year, we unfortunately don't have yet any knowledge about how it works in the practice, but I was told from my ministry that they have received a lot of requests about how to interpret this law from companies, and that is a sign that obviously they are in the process of adapting their contracts. So there must be some effect in the practice. The prohibitions in the German law, that's important to mention, only apply in the relationship between a supplier and the economically stronger buyer. This is something that is laid down in the directive. The German law here follows the tiered approach of the UTP directive and protects suppliers with an annual turnover up to 350 million euro. That is a threshold foreseen in the directive. Provided that the annual turnover of the supplier is lower than the buyer's annual turnover. That's important. So the buyer has to be always in a weaker, the supplier has to be always in a weaker position. In addition, suppliers of milk, and that is relevant for you, meat, fruit, vegetables, and horticulture products with an annual turnover up to 4 billion euro in the relevant sector in Germany are protected, also if their total annual turnover does not exceed 20% of the buyer's total annual turnover. Very difficult to follow, I find. This, again, is a provision that goes beyond the minimum standard of the directive, and that is something that came very late into our legislation because it turned out that some major dairy companies would have stayed out of the protection if we wouldn't have hired the threshold. So finally, let me talk about the enforcement of the German law on protecting the supply chain. Suppliers that face unfair trade practices, they can direct or file a complaint to the German Federal Agency for Agriculture and Food, which acts as an enforcement agency. And it is important to know that this agency is under the subordinated to the Ministry of Agriculture. So the Ministry of Agriculture can influence its decisions. And that was a big discussion between the German cartel office. You can imagine they were not happy to see some legislation going out of their hands into the hands, let's say, of the Ministry of Agriculture. It was a fierce discussion, but the Ministry of Agriculture was finally powerful enough to bring it through. The enforcement authority may also conduct investigation on its own initiative, and it can impose a fine up to 750,000 euro maximum. The directive foresees that sanction must be effective and dissuasive. What exactly that means is in the discretion of the member states to set down. Germany has chosen 750,000 euro. It would be interesting to hear how high will be the fines in Poland, for example. Finally, it was also decided within the legislative process to set up an independent ombudsman office for more fairness in the supply chain, and they will watch carefully what is happening here. Although I have to say it's not, the structure of this ombudsman office is not yet very clear how it will look like. It might be influenced by the ongoing the parliamentary elections in Germany, what it exactly can do at the end. It's a discussion that is going on. So let me conclude. The new provisions prohibit the new law on protecting the supply chain in agriculture prohibits unfair trade practices by strengthening the position of smaller producers and suppliers, and therefore contributes to more fairness in the agricultural and food supply chains. Let's hope it will have an effect in practice. We will see. Maybe next year, I can tell you. So thank you very much.
Dziękujemy bardzo. I kolejna.
Very much. And now the next presentation is a kind of additional topic, a side topic, but also connected with regulations. That is, let me invite Mieczysław Objensky, who is president of the board of TÜV Polska. The standards of the Polish Chamber of Milk. No GMO, that's the name of the standard. Let's wait for the lecturer. Let me add an important logistic information for those who are to leave today. Our forum, please check out of the hotel and take your luggage. You must do it by 1 p.m., but of course, please stay with us for the conference, and especially those that stay until tomorrow at the gala. So I'm very happy to welcome you, and it's nice to be again at the forum and to present to you the standard of the Polish Chamber of Milk in this area. From the perspective of good practices, at least market practices such industry solutions show the experiences of ours, and our measures already have effect for the dairy sector and consumers and retailers chains. as well as regards especially labeling of products. So why do we have these issues connected with no GMO labeling? First, of course, these are the trends among consumers and declaration that is to be passed on by producers as regards the form of feeding animals and the ingredients that specific food products contain. What is more, this is not only observed in Poland, but also at the European level or international level as regards issues and criteria resulting also from export requirements. Another issue is one of the elements that may enable the company to stand out as compared to their competitors. So as you see, in the EU there are various standards and regulations. And best known is FLOC, which is a German own technique. That's in Austria. We also have French systems and Italian systems. And there are many other standards that also started such labeling in this framework, and they started to support their members in that way, or the members that are part of some special certification systems to be introduced with regard to this labeling. So that functions at the domestic level, at the European level, and well, we have to face it. So now, as for the key provisions connected with labeling and specification of products with this logo in the sector, there are two labeling and no GMO and the declaration about animal feeding stating that animal feeds did not contain GMO ingredients. So in the majority we have here EU regulations specifying these levels from 0.9. I mean, for animal feeding stuffs, for also dairy products, where feeding animals above that, when it is not technologically justified, or with this adulteration which is introduced deliberately, then such labeling no GMO cannot be used for the dairy products. We also have our Polish regulations that provided for these issues. I mean, we have here two signs, no GMO, and the other is kind of produced without GMO use. So the first one is for compound products and products of plant origin, and the second one is for animal products, including dairy products. So it is mainly voluntary labeling, but it must comply with special rules and standards resulting from the law, and also the obligation to be verified by, for example, a special inspection services when the product is to be introduced on the market. Hence, for example, okay, let me rephrase it. Before that, we also had the standard of the Polish Chamber of Milk. So after the legal act has been introduced, this standard has been adjusted to the needs. So this standard is the first standard in Poland, which comprehensively covers the food chain. First, it focused on the dairy sector, which through specific requirements for all operators in the chain created and is still creating the whole part connected with ensuring transparency and ensuring appropriate labeling by dairies at the end. So at the very end, it is the producer, what I mean here now, the dairy plant is responsible for labeling the products with a logo, and the standard to a large extent helps minimize risks related to the occurrence of any irregularities on farms and animal feed companies. There is a lot of companies certified in this respect. They are not only dairies, but mainly farms, groups producing milk. Here we have also animal feed companies, companies involved in trading animal feed. So the whole chain which can be verified. So what it gave us, first of all, we have a unified approach to the use of the requirements, and all entities have their role and tasks in this, and the standard enables in an easy, clear and transparent way to ensure a compliance with the requirements of the Polish law. So we can put it straightforwardly. So when we have special documents and comply with the rules which are verified by the entity participating in the certification, they definitely have a greater chance to be in compliance with provisions by law. So speaking simply, these rules enable us to somehow be in compliance with the law. So, and it enables also to simplify the conducting of all inspections, which are important from the viewpoint of inspection services, because inspection is prepared and tests are carried out within the system, and therefore we must have certainty that labeling put finally on the product has been right. So now some figures. That is how within the last 2 years it all has developed. We have now over 30 dairies and producer groups that are certified, and over 173 audits were carried out. We audited almost 2,500 farms at the time. I mean, those that were under supervision. We were there, we saw the farms, our auditors went there on site, they checked how it all looked, how animal feeding looked, where they bought animal feeds, and within the framework of that, we issued 97 certificates. So soon we will see who will get the 100th certificate. So let me repeat. Now we have a group of companies which is in the process of implementing these rules. At the moment, it's about 200 entities interested in entering the system, and that's why it is a group of the next 20,000 farms which are or will take part in the certification process in the nearest future. We have 8 highly qualified auditors who not only focus on verifying the requirements, but mainly on education. And this is crucial, because this education on the rules to be applied on farm or in the plant is very important, and these auditors are experienced not only from the viewpoint of the dairy plant,
w ramach takich typowych audytów systemowych
They
na
have
zakładzie,
experience in
ale przede wszystkim
so-called
też,
systems
co
audits
bardzo
in
dobrze sobie
various
radzą w
plants,
gospodarstwach,
and they
biorąc pod
cope
uwagę też
very well on
specyfikę i
farms,
formę, w jakiej
taking
trzeba
into
te
account,
audyty prowadzić.
I mean, specific situation and
Proszę Państwa,
form
mamy teraz
in
obecnie
which
też
the audits are to be carried
kolejną
out.
też
And
pewną
we have
aktualizację
also now some kind of
standardów,
update
wynikającą też
of
między innymi z kolejnych
standards.
potrzeb,
So
informacji
due
zwrotnych,
to
które też
the
dostaliśmy w trakcie
needs
audytów,
and the feedback that we
zmian,
got
które też
during audits
pojawiły się
and the
chociażby
changes
z
which
państw, czy z partnerów handlowych
were introduced
na rynku, bo to
by
też
trading partners
standard
on the
został
market
zauważony
because the
chociażby też między
standard
innymi przez
was
sieci handlowe.
noticed by
No i przede wszystkim
retail
też konieczność
chains,
dostosowania się do
and
zmieniających
it was also
wymagań,
necessary
czy
to
prawnych,
introduce
czy kwestii
to the
związanych z
changing legal
nowymi chociażby
adaptations
technikami
or
badań,
new
czy
techniques
elementami, które też
of tests
wymagają
or
uzupełnienia z
other
punktu widzenia
elements that should be added here
całego systemu
from
i
the
łańcucha.
perspective of the whole system and
Pierwszą
the
istotną
chain.
rzeczą,
So the first crucial
która wprowadza
thing
nowy
that is
element
introduced
standardu, przede
by
wszystkim
a
jest
new element of the
otwarcie się
standard,
na,
it is first of all opening
na wszelkich
to
producentów żywności.
all food
Myśmy,
producers.
między innymi tutaj
I
Polska
mean,
Izba Mleka
here
miała
a
wiele zgłoszeń
Polish Chamber of
firm,
Milk
które
have many
niekoniecznie
submissions from
produkują
companies
produkty
which do not necessarily
produkty mleczne, ale między innymi też inne
manufacture
produkty,
milk
gdzie
products, but also other products
klienci
where
wymagają od nich
clients require from them
zgodności z
the
wymaganiami,
confirmation
jeżeli chodzi o
of
znakowanie.
compliance
Stąd ten standard,
with labeling
w swoim
requirements.
zakresie
Hence, the
otworza się
standard
też na inne
now
branże, też te
is
związane po części z
opening to other, let's say,
z
subsectors,
mleczarską,
but
związaną
partly
chociażby
connected
z
with the
producentami
dairy sector,
dodatków,
such as
producentami
producers
wszelkich
of
innych
some
produktów
kind of
pochodzenia
ingredient
roślinnego, w
supplements
których
or any
tego
other
typu,
plant products
znakowanie może być zastosowane.
where such labeling
W większym
could
stopniu
be
też będziemy się
applied.
skupiać
And to a
na
large extent,
uszczelnieniu
we also
łańcucha
focus
paszowego,
on
znajdowania
the
między innymi
feed
tutaj jest element mieszanych
chain.
pasz, mobilnych mieszanych
So
pasz,
there
które
should be
też
the
będą
kind of
ujęte.
mobile
I
feed mills
przede
that
wszystkim
would be
też
included
podejście
here,
do
and
zwiększonej do analizy ryzyka.
what would be
Chcemy
important
być
here
zdecydowanie
is
częściej w
risk
gospodarstwach,
analysis.
chcemy
We
widzieć
want to
przede
more
wszystkim,
frequently
jak to
visit
wygląda,
farms.
po to,
We
żebyśmy
want
też
to
mieli
know how it
pewność,
all
że
looks,
te
so
zasady
that to
obowiązują.
be certain that they
Ważnym
comply
elementem
with the
jest to,
rules.
że
And what is
chcemy też,
important
aby
is that
zdecydowanie
we
łatwiej i
want
prościej nastąpiła chociażby
to
weryfikacja
have kind of easier and simpler verification
zakresu produktu, który
of the
jest
scope of the
ujęty
product, which
w
is
zakresie
part of
certyfikatu. Przede wszystkim, jeżeli chodzi
the
właśnie o te produkty
certification.
do żywienia,
What I mean here,
stąd
it's
też
mainly
jest kwestia wprowadzenia
so
QR-kodu,
animal feeds, hence
mający na
the
celu
issue of QR
ułatwić,
code introduction
tego typu
has appeared, and this code
weryfikacje
is
ze
to
strony,
enable such verification by
kupującego
farmers
tego typu pasz,
buying this
bo będziemy
type
po prostu
of
od razu
animal
sprawdzić, czy taki
feeds.
produkt
He would be
podlega
able
pod
to
zakres,
check
czy nie.
whether this product is included into the scope
Jak
of
wspominałem,
such labeling or not. So, as I've
standard
already
cały czas się
mentioned,
rozwija.
the standard is
Tak jak
developing
mówię,
all the
wprowadziliśmy
time.
dodatkowe
We
katalogi
introduce
wymagań,
new
kolejne
catalogs
grupy,
of
które w tym
requirements
zakresie mogą
and
skorzystać
more
z tych
groups
zasad,
that
tym samym też
could
ułatwiać sobie funkcjonowanie
use
w
these
ramach
rules
tego
and
znakowania,
thus
mieć
enable
pewność, że
themselves
jest
function
to realizowane
with
właściwie.
functioning
Co więcej,
within this
standard
labeling
nie tylko wskazuje
are
na
included, and the standard does
rozwija
not
się z punktu
only
widzenia
develop
tylko obszaru
from
bez GMO
the
i tego znakowania, ale
perspective
też
of no
patrzy na
GMO
kolejne
labeling,
potrzeby
but
wynikające chociażby
also
z tych
takes into
wyzwań,
account other needs
branża ma
resulting
przed sobą.
from
bardzo przez ostatnie
challenges
miesiące
that the
intensywnie
dairy
pracowała chociażby
sector
nowa grupa robocza
faces. Hence, we had a
w ramach
new working group
tworzenia
established
standardu i
to
obszarów
create a
związanych
standard
z
and
dobrostanem
areas
zwierząt.
connected with animal
z standardem
welfare with the
z
standard
tego zakresu.
for this particular
I tutaj też,
issue. And
mamy już
here
opracowany
we
standard
also
i w
have
niedługim czasie
developed
będziemy
the
prowadzić,
standard, and soon
audyty,
we will conduct
testowe.
so-called
Ten
testing
projekt, myślę,
audits,
też pokaże,
and
w
the
jaki
project,
sposób
I guess, will show
będzie można
how
te-
it will be
ten standard
possible
przede wszystkim
to create the standard from the viewpoint of the industry needs, because it's a industrial sectoral standard, which is first of all to support our dairy sector with a view to the challenges that are appearing in the dairy sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions connected with the standard, I'd be willing to give you answers during the break. We will be willing to answer your questions, so thank you very much, and please stay with us, because you will take part in the next panel.
I poproszę
And now I would like to invite the panelists, Mrs. Bernadetta Kasztelan-Świetlik, Gesell & Partners Law Firm, Mr. Bernard Ader, President La Coopération Agricole, Mr. Friedman Kraft, Agricultural Counselor in the Embassy in Warsaw. Would you please take your seats? It's a really convenient seat. During the first presentation, we heard clearly there were attempts to regulate or self-regulate the sector by the companies. It took many years, a lot of effort, and it did not bring any fruit. And finally, large-scale retail networks withdrew from this self-regulatory attempts. A similar situation was in Germany and in France. We all discussed this because it's of great importance. It is a problem that cannot be easily solved. So, should we speak of self-regulation or parliamentary acts, parliamentary legislation? Incentives or penalties on who can earn and how much. This is the subject of our discussion during this panel. So let us start with this specific framework. To what extent should the regulation come from the upper level down to the lower level? Or because companies not always can organize the market well by themselves. So to what extent, to what degree should the regulations be imposed from the higher level, or to what extent should to what degree should the freedom be left to the sector? I have presented my opinion as Vice President of the Office for Competition and Consumer Protection for regulatory issues. And if companies, entrepreneurs negotiate among themselves the terms included in the Code of Good Practice that are satisfactory to all the parties, such a solution would eliminate this aspect of involvement in possession of administrative solutions into the sector of companies. I have always been of the opinion that the state should not get involved too strongly into the activities of individual sectors. It's not good for the market. Agnieszka is a witness. I've always been of this opinion. Agnieszka has been a witness when we met still at the Ministry of Agriculture. I would advise to the retail chains, for instance, let's sit together, let's negotiate. But I was wrong. We didn't get any success in that. The large retail sales withdrew from this attempt to regulate, to self-regulate the sector. So it's probably a sociological issue. Everyone wants to earn more, and this desire for earning profit is so big that we forget about other participants of the market. We see just our own profit. So, if you ask to whom the margin should go, everyone should have their margin they deserve. Obviously, as a lawyer, I have been going through trade agreements that are 60 pages long, and still they are unable to provide for any possible actions of human beings. In the past, shaking the hands between the people was better than an agreement. So I have always supported as a self-regulation, but as human beings now, we have reached a strange stage where everyone wants to have everything regulated for them. If there are no regulations, no party, no entity will step back. And agriculture is also sensitive to weather conditions, for instance. And my experience has shown that if the weather was good for farmers, I mean, there were many products on the market. Then the prices dropped, and there were complaints from food producers that there were very negative situations in trade agreements because of the dropping prices. When the weather was bad for farmers, I had complaints from the other side, from the sales chains, saying, oh, there is some plot between the food producers. Well, it seems we have reached a stage where voluntary agreements are not sufficient, and there is no step back. Regulation seems to be necessary, although we still have to make sure we do not over-regulate the market. There has to be some freedom left for companies, for entrepreneurs, because if their life is over-regulated, they will never be innovative, never be developing. So you mean we are not mature enough as human beings to self-regulate? Well, we have been in the past, we are not now. Maybe a time will come in the future again. Can we get somehow legally secured, protected, because the regulations protect the weaker partners in the chain, the weaker entities in the chain, and the bigger ones, the bigger entities will then be forced to reduce their prices then? So my question to France. In France, you mentioned, you discussed a lot, you have many regulations. Is there any particular aspect of which you are proud and which you would recommend for introducing in other countries? Obviously, we have different social life models between our countries, so it can be transposed in 100% exactly. But would you propose any solution of yours to introduce by other countries? As I have mentioned, not everything that is regulated is bad. As we come for this act, the Positive aspect is that acts are not always ideal, but the interested parties also have to be left with the possibility to get self-organized by themselves. If the act is too detailed, it will spoil everything. So my statement is not to make the acts too specific, too detailed. And the fact that
Mówi
the
pan o
act
ustawie EGalim, tej ostatniej, tak?
exists is
Mówi pan o ustawie EGalim, tak?
so you are mentioning the act EGalim. Tak. Yes, I was mentioning the EGalim Act, whose aim was to protect the producers for them to be able to sell their products with some margin, not at the cost level. The production cost is changing, obviously, is different depending on the size of the farm. For instance, smaller companies have higher costs of production, larger ones have smaller costs, and then this is already an element that's blocking certain solutions, but a lot depends on the organization of the sector itself, on farmers. If we leave the farmers to themselves, and if we leave the farmers only to cooperate by themselves with the retail chains, then there will be a price war again. So we also have to jointly introduce new standards, new labels, maybe even, so that products are made jointly, and this would improve the situation on the market. And there is a lot of opportunities, it seems, for getting organized together. In Poland, this has not been successful either, to get so strong representation. You, in your presentation, mentioned your organization deals with lobbying for the benefit of your community. My question to the representative of Germany is now, in your country you have quite detailed regulations, quite ordered system, you have the blacklist, you have the gray list. So how does this work? I mean, in your country, it seems you do not have so many movements at the bottom level, at the grassroots level, among the farmers. And despite this lack of such movement of the farmers, do these regulations work well?
Hello? Okay, it's on. What you just mentioned, I wouldn't say that we have no movement on bottom level. We have a very strong new movement. I can only compare to Agro-Unia in Poland. It's really a grassroots, bottom-up movement. And this movement managed to sign codes of practice with the retail sector. That is the first non-binding, voluntary, not legally binding agreement of the retail sector, and it was just signed this summer, so we have to see how that will develop. So that's interesting. But if it comes to regulation, if I understand your question right, we don't have such a broad approach, let's say, like in France. We are more reluctant to interfere with legislation, and especially my ministry in the last years, and that is not only true if it comes to farming association, it's also true with reducing food waste, reducing sugar in products. We strictly follow the way of voluntary agreements among economy and the ministry. But I have to say that critics would say this way was not very successful. So it will be very, I think we're at the point now, also we have to see who will be the next minister in Germany. Everything is possible now. It can be from the liberals, it can be from the Greens, it can be from the, really, we don't know. So depending on the outcome of the election, I think we can see a shift to more regulation, which didn't take place in the last years. But one thing I cannot imagine in Germany is that we would interfere in the price. We would try to set a minimum price or somehow regulate the way the price is negotiated, because that we see traditionally very critical. Usually we think that it doesn't work, but it can change with the new government, of course.
No właśnie, to jeszcze dochodzi wpływ polityki na prawo i na...
Here we get to the issue of politics and how it influences the market. So now my question to the next speaker, last in order, is that you mentioned the voices of each of the participants to the dialogue have to be heard properly. So can you tell us, at the Polish Milk Chamber, you have this non-GMO certification project developing right now. Is this difficult to convince the individual parties, the individual entities, to follow the principles of this project? Well, yes, I can give you a bit of history. The standard for non-GMO was the standard originating in the fact that the labeling of products available in the market was varied. There were different systems, different labels, and we heard from producers that, for instance, different companies were changing the packaging, changing the marks, the labels placed on the packaging, and this was a problem. Companies were educating farmers, were educating different farming companies, and suddenly other companies introduced their own marking. So when the standard was finally achieved, when we got Piątnica becoming the first owner of the certificate, the ministry got interested and started to work more intensively on the act, parliamentary act, that was planned for many years, but nobody did anything about it. And just because of this bottom-level initiative, this upwards trend to get the labeling, the market of the products organized on the market, the upper level got interesting. Obviously, this was probably different than in France and in Germany, because it seems in your countries those activities were kind of more parallel. But in our country, it was a kind of a result of the need that existed, as I am saying. Those bottom-up initiatives at the bottom level, they require a broader approach, I think, by the state than in a situation when it does things their own way. We have recently experienced in meeting different institutions, state institutions, showing no support at all for such bottom-up initiatives. showing no support for the industry. So I think or we even had situations where those grassroots level initiatives were stopped by the state, and nobody wanted to listen to the voices of our industry, because they believed it's better if they regulated as the state, their own way. And actually what happened in many cases is that the regulations were in a way imposed from the upper level in a way which does not meet the needs of industries. So I believe that the regulations, if they are introduced, they should be adjusted to the needs of the basic bottom level, as Mrs. Director has mentioned when she worked for the Office for Consumer Competition Protection. She was also for more self-regulatory measures, yes. And well, in this adds we also have international challenges as well in this area. Yes, we have the challenges related to cooperation between governments, between countries. You, in your presentations, also referred to the EU directive on unfair trading practices relating to the Agri-Food products. France and Germany have already implemented that directive. Poland is doing it only now. So my question to France is, from the perspective of your country, how would you assess the directive's compatibility with your own French regulations?
Ça se présente assez facilement puisqu'on est un petit peu à l'initiative également de ce type de loi.
It's quite, this coordination is quite good because actually we were the initiators, and we are well used to transposing different EU directives, and the transposition took place quite recently, and we are at the first stage of introducing it. But the EU level is kind of higher in you, or what is the situation? You have the EU directive introduced now in 100% or not yet? Not in 100%.
Oui.
Tak, w 100%.
Yes,
in 100%.
nie było dotychczas. Chcemy się dowiedzieć po prostu,
what we want to find out is how it works. Was it simple for you that you just introduced the provisions of the directive directly in your own law, or you changed it somehow?
Że ustawa musi bardzo długo pofunkcjonować na rynku, żebyśmy zobaczyli, czy to
bezkolizyjne Mrs. Director is adding that the law has to work for quite long time in the market so that to assess whether it works well or not. So the same question to Germany: how does this transposition of the directive work in your country, please?
Well, the process was speeded up because it came at a time when it was a big issue, the fair prices for producers. There was a lot of pressures from farmers. There was a summit led by Angela Merkel on this issue. That's never a good sign for a German agricultural minister if Merkel takes over. But it shows that it's really in the center of political discussion. And at this time, they speeded up very much with the transposition of this directive. So there was no problem to transpose it. And there was even the political will to go beyond the minimum standard, which is a bit unusual for Germany, I would say. It was triggered more from farmers' organization, I think. But about the effect in practice, unfortunately, I cannot say anything. It's just too new. As I just mentioned in my presentation, nevertheless, there are a lot of requests on how to interpret these provisions. That means, obviously, people work on contracts now to adapt them. So there must be some effect in the practice.
No właśnie, trzeba poczekać, bo chciałam zapytać o konkrety. Czy już widać jakieś skutki praktyczne?
Exactly. I was just about to ask, are there any practical effects existing by now or not yet? Not any.
To spowodowało zmniejszenie.
Has there been, for instance, any decrease for instance, I mean, in unfair practices, because that's the objective of the directive, to decrease unfair practices?
Berlin, and they said, sorry, we don't know yet. We know in 1 year, and you also have to see that usually the law gets important when there's a legal case. So we will know how it's interpreted. It will be important to see what the courts make with it, and if it has effects in the practice. No, at the moment we don't know. We have a feeling that there is some impact, but we don't know.
Rzeczywiście, jako praktyk, prawnik czuję się trochę wywołany.
Practitioner, lawyer, I actually feel I should say something. Let me emphasize again, to find out about the actual real impact, real effects, we need time to assess those effects. If you want to assess the effects of having the directive implemented into national legislations, I will tell you from my practice, you need at least 3 years. For instance, in December 2016 and in the middle of 2017, we expected the first introduction of this transposing act, which then was not introduced at all finally, but the representatives of big retail companies were contacting me because they were afraid of this upcoming regulation, which never entered into force. But they were afraid and they were asking questions, and I told them at least 6 months are needed for you to get acquainted, to understand the Parliamentary Act, to find out about its content. We sent a questionnaire to the different organizations, and the questionnaire told us that the retail companies started to withdraw from those most negative practices, trading practices. The same work, and this was only with an expected act which never entered into force. Now we have the act that entered into force, and again, we still need time over which documents will be collected and there will be legal proceedings ongoing, which then will be considered by courts. So time is needed. The implementation of courts or other entities that have been tasked with considering such cases, depending on the country. I think this question should be asked to us in 2 years' time from now, because now we can only have some practical signals, and I think the lawyers who represent large retail companies are already checking their agreements and verifying those agreements against this act, but no legal proceedings have yet ended. And speaking about the supply chain, is the largest problem lying in the relationship between the big retail chains and producers, who are kind of the first stage in this chain, and the dominant role of the retail networks, because they want to earn more and more, and they forget about producers, they forget. Although we know how economy works, and if you get involved too strongly from the state level, it's not too good either, but I think those
wydaje mi się, że
there are
przybywa, chociaż to
more
trzeba ciągle kontrolować.
better
I bardzo tego
practices,
pilnować.
trading
Ale proszę
practices
powiedzieć,
on
czy to
the
jest
market
największy
right
właśnie
now, but
problem, ta
is
opozycja
this
między
the
sieciami
main problem, the
handlowymi,
kind
a
of
pozostałymi
opposition
elementami
between
tego
retail
łańcucha?
networks on the one hand
Czy
and the
tych momentów
producers
regulacji musi
on
być
the other
jeszcze
hand,
więcej,
on the other
zdecydowanie
end of the chain, or there are more conflicts, more oppositions?
Może ja parę słów.
Maybe I will say a few words.
Bardziej od strony
Speaking
osoby,
from the
która
side of
pomiędzy
the
obiema
person
stronami bardzo często występuje,
who
ponieważ z reguły bardzo często zdarza mi się
actually
chociażby
works
teraz
on
z ramienia
both
sieci
sides,
przyjeżdżać
let me
do
say,
firm,
because
audytować
I
po
audit
określonych standardach i
companies
normach.
according to
Więc,
the standards nowadays,
Więc to jest, myślę,
but
kwestia
I
zawsze,
worked from the side of the
tak jak też
companies
pani
in the
wcześniej
past.
wspomniała,
So
kwestia kooperacji.
this is the issue of cooperation. The network, retail network, would not be able to exist without suppliers and without the producers of the products. So
Kwestia tutaj pozycji wynika w dużym stopniu
these are
od
as if two ends to the same
tego, w
stick,
jaki
and
sposób, po
if
pierwsze,
we
regulator na rynku działa, w
well,
jaki sposób też ma
we have a regulator on the market now with the tools to cut off, to eliminate those unfair practices, to eliminate them from the market. On the other hand,
nasuwa się wniosek, że u nas w Polsce przede wszystkim ich
we in
w ogóle
Poland
nie ma lub jest ich bardzo
do
mało.
not have
To też jest kwestia tego, w jaki
those
sposób dani producenci, przedsiębiorcy mówią
intra-industry
jednym głosem w
regulations,
kwestiach, i są w stanie
bottom
też w
level
odpowiedni
regulations. We
sposób,
don't have many
komunikować
of
kwestie
those.
nie tylko w stosunku do instytucji
But
rządowych, ale
I
też
think the
do
problem
innych
is
swoich,
also about communicating,
branż
about mutual
bliskich,
exchange
czy też
of communications
konsumenta.
regarding
Znowu
the
mogę
mutual
podać
expectations,
bardzo świetne
because the
rozwiązania,
expectations
które
of
chociażby są w
producers
Niemczech.
are
System QS
different,
w
the
tym
retail
obszarze,
chain
który w sposób,
expectations are different. In Germany there is the QR
wielki sposób,
system, for
w ramach
instance,
dobrowolnego standardu
and there is
branżowego,
this
właściwie wielobranżowego,
industry or even multi-industry
przez lata, właściwie
standard
teraz mamy 25 lat,
operating for, I guess, over 20 years by now, I guess, in Germany.
zrobił niesamowitą
And this standard has
robotę, jeżeli chodzi o
done
właśnie
really
między innymi
big
też
job
relacje pomiędzy dostawcami.
also as
Ponieważ
regards the
siadają razem w
relationship
grupach roboczych,
between the
ustalają pewne
suppliers
standardy
and
dotyczące
retail chains.
komunikowania,
And there
funkcjonowania
have
na
to
rynku,
be
ustalania
standards
standardów
of
bezpieczeństwa, jakości i
communicating
znakowania też
information, for
I to
instance,
się
relating to
udało
labeling,
zrobić
to
na zasadzie
food
wspólnego,
safety,
oddolnego
to
działania,
other aspects, and
tworząc
this
system,
has
który
been done
faktycznie funkcjonuje w
as a
Niemczech,
result of kind of
rozwija się
bottom-up
w
activities
Hiszpanii,
of industry
rozwija
or
się w innych
industries.
też krajach, bo
Such a
te zasady
system
po
also
prostu
exists in Spain, for instance,
są dla wszystkich jasne, klarowne i
and they have quite clear, although voluntary, rules.
a więc wszyscy grają
And
na tym samym
nearly everyone has joined the system,
Ten
which
element
has
standaryzacji też
created a
ułatwia,
level playing
więcej
field.
wspierany przez instytucje rządowe,
And the
które,
government only supports
regulują te obszary,
such a
gdzie
system
te
by
przewagi,
regulating
mogą być
those areas
nadmiernie
where
wykorzystywane.
advantages can be abused.
Cały czas szukamy u siebie w Polsce
And we
nowych
in
rozwiązań,
Poland are
jakie są, bym
looking
powiedział,
for
sprawdzone i świetne.
other
Wystarczy tylko
new,
wyłącznie je odpowiednio
other
dostosować
different
do naszych
solutions. I think we should just
Ja mam taką
analyze
dużą
the
nadzieję,
solutions
że
that exist already
właśnie
in
standard
our
będzie
countries.
tym
Obviously,
Tym powszechnym.
then after
jeszcze
analyzing them,
doreguluje,
then to
przy
draw
okazji
conclusions based on
Ja
on those
poproszę teraz,
conclusions
osoby z sali, które
to
mają
self-regulate
pytania,
our
czy chcą coś
sectors too. Now my
dopowiedzieć.
question
Bardzo
is,
proszę.
does anybody from the floor, from the participants would have any questions to the panelists, please? I would like to ask a question as Vice President of Copa Cogeca. Can you hear me well? Can people hear me? We have been working on those issues for over 10 years now, and the situation is very complicated. But This is an issue that is a legal issue on the one hand and a structural issue on the other hand. In Spain, we have an act that has been adopted in 2013, an act that combats unfair trade practices, and it is based on the French trading code. Actually, this was used also when developing the directive at the EU level. So our own legislation was used to develop the EU development. If there is no regulation in the sector, well, we have to self-regulate, and there can be situations when there is no free competition. We, as cooperatives, see what is happening in the market. We see what is happening in Spain. The European Commission has sent letters to the individual countries because not all the countries have transposed the directive. And I think regulations transposing this directive are necessary. If we have if we have lack of balance, if we have market imbalance, we have to protect the farmers on bilaterally basis, because these are bilateral relations and should be. So we should not take the opinion of the regulator that apart from regulating bilateral relations, we should impose some additional regulations. The regulations should not change the realities. The realities are structural in nature. We have systems that are well-structured, well-ordered, like in Germany, and there are other systems that are really more self-regulated, like in France. And both of these systems work well. So even if we have a directive, if we transpose it, it can be difficult to change the situation if the structural requirements are not met, if the structure is not working properly. And if you said that regulations should not create realities. That is true, but there is another problem, and my question to all the panelists here: do regulations actually follow the realities? Do they reflect the realities that exist? For instance, look, we got this cooperation, this COVID-related disturbances in the market initially. There are different situations, different factors that can take place, and there can be different groups who would use the gaps in the law. So do the regulations always reflect the realities? Barbara, can we start with you? I think I'm monopolizing this discussion now. It should be regulated.
So from my perspective, indeed, it is so that law is one step behind, always, a little bit at least. Because, of course, there are some exceptions, so that to, let's say, force someone to some behavior, you create a particular provision that provides for some standards, and we want to reach these standards. But generally, what I've been observing is, I mean, law and the state with its power, and there's where there is something going on the market. People are unable to reach agreement, and then everyone is looking at the state and wanting the state to regulate these issues. So if we are to transfer it to the relationships between suppliers and buyers, then in my opinion, many years ago, there was no such a problem, because we were, as, let's say, humankind, we are not so developed as to produce such huge quantities of food. Food was then kind of a rare, scarce good, expensive good, and it was really supplies who cared more, and they had a stronger bargaining position. However, the development of agriculture, of food processing, I mean, various types of processing of food, it may be now stored longer, led to a situation that we have a kind of surplus of products. And if there is a surplus of products, you know what's going on. Prices go down, and everyone who produces something wants to sell the product, but not everyone who wants to buy the product buys from this particular producer, because there is quite a lot of products on the market. As for this directive, it seems that it is here, and these provisions entered into force because somehow I mean, this kind of imbalance was somehow distorted on the market. I don't know exactly when it happened, but if I look at Poland, I mean, various litigations about so-called self-fees, these were court cases, and these were behaviors enforced by large retailer chains. If you want me to sell your product, you must do such and such a thing, pay for such and such a thing, for adverts, for kind of retail chains, anniversaries, etc., various events. So I guess it started at the late 1990s, at least. I know I've been following from the time. So this idea is to regulate it as self-regulation or through the law. I mean, these ideas were kind of response to the signals from the market. As my colleague from Germany said, he said something about his agency in Germany, and there were some attempts at adapting regulations on competition law to these relationships, but it was impossible. And according to the presentation of the gentleman from France, we know that the market structure is such that in Poland, no retail chain has dominant power within the meaning of the Act on Protection of Consumers and Competition, because the dominant position is such when the retailer has a position that it does not take into account other partners. We don't have such a dominant position company. Of course, retailers do have a big position because they have 20% share on the market, but none of them has 40%. Then why this anti-competition law did not work well, and hence we had this need to regulate. So to discuss whether the law is before and after, I mean, law as a rule and the majority enters when there is a problem and people are unable to resolve it in a different way. It's good that it is by law and not by war. That's good, I guess. That's a good situation because law is later. So now a representative of France, indeed, is it so that does the law follow the reality, even in the perspective of the pandemic, for example? I mean, our reality has changed dramatically. And what is your opinion?
Alors là, j'ai déjà entendu votre question parce que
So I've already heard the question when I compare it to what was heard. And earlier I had some technical problem and I couldn't hear the other problem. I had some humming noise in the receiver. Okay, but I now understand. As regards this particular issue,
sur l'histoire de la loi qui est à côté de la réalité ou pas.
That is, on the provisions of the law, which are kind of next to the reality. No, the law is inspired by reality. It's a kind of echo of the reality. We know that reality is changing fast, the landscape changes fast, the situation evolves very quickly. So we see it every day. The COVID pandemic, we changed everything, it reorganized everything. The law, when it is well thought over, when it is then adopted and applied, sometimes, I mean, we need some more time because it may not be fully adapted to the reality. As regards the provisions that we've been discussing right now, I mean, they are aimed at protecting and preventing unfair practices. This is something, let's say, timeless, universal. So in fact, this law and provisions are sort of normal. They are to give protection against unfair trading practices. And it seems to me that there is a system of laws which might be interesting. I mean, everything that is to protect farmers through the insurance system. Today, we deal with the markets which may go up, down, change from the viewpoint of harvest. I mean, various events may happen, natural disasters, etc. may happen. So, in putting it into the system via law or obligation, the obligation of insurance, so that to enable this form of regulation, it is something which could be an additional element to what we've been discussing so far. Okay, so now the German perspective, please. What about this law? Is it following the reality or not? I mean, do you, in your experience, have an event, let's say, or something that made the law react to any situation covering many branches, many industries, any practice that you had to somehow conquer, to stop?
I mean, if this law or law in general reflects the reality is almost a philosophical question probably, but especially if it comes to this law, I think we maybe have to ask farmers or representatives of organizations if they feel an effect of it. But from reading the comments made on this law in Germany, there was a great concern that this law focused too much on what you mentioned, on the relation between retailers and processors. And that the farmer actually is not really in the focus of this direction. I'm not able to say if it's true or not, but I've seen this concern in comments from farmer organizations. That you focus too much on the processing company relations with the production company with a retailer, but actually it's a farmer who is concerned. My personal feeling about this law is that it won't change that much in Germany, honestly, because I think we will delete some very tough or strong wrong developments, let's say, with the fact that you cannot say one day, tomorrow, please, I ordered 100 salads and now I don't need them anymore. Okay, that is over. But that still doesn't change the principle inequalities that the market power brings within. So it's an important thing to do, but I don't see that it's a fundamental change, actually. It's my very personal opinion. Because it's obviously the same situation in France. We have such a strong power of the retail sector, and I think in Germany we have one of the lowest food prices in Europe. It is amazing. Sometimes I have the feeling it's lower than in Poland, to be honest. How is that possible? And we are a rich country. And it has a lot to do with the fact, and here I'm very critical with my own country, people are not willing to pay for food. That's the problem. The food has to be cheap. It's a very German problem, I think. You buy, you know, often when we go shopping and I see people driving with a Porsche to Lidl, you know, that doesn't make sense to me. But that's you see very often in Germany. I mean, okay, Lidl is not a bad place, but in German eyes it's a little bit a discount, you know. That's also a problem.
Być może na zakupach w Lidlu oszczędzają na ubezpieczeniu.
When they do shopping in Lidl, they save money to be able to insure their Porsche. Anyone else would like to say something or ask a question to our experts? So I will go with a mic so that you must speak to the mic. So Piotr Knauer, Hochland company. This is one of those processors. So I think that all these issues that we've been discussing right now, I mean, in my opinion, we must look more in depth here. Why? do such things happen. For example, such that prices of dairy products in Poland are the lowest in Europe. And here I must correct the colleague that food as such is very cheap in Germany, but as regards cheese, I would give you an example. There's the so-called cottage cheese in Poland. The retail price on average is almost half of the price of the products sold where? Not in Germany, in Romania, where incomes are lower than in Poland. So why I am saying that? Maybe it's not a popular thing, but I think that we as the sector, dairy sector, as dairy cooperatives, I mean all dairies in fact, should look at each other. So why do we let such situation happen? I mean in Poland and in Germany the situation is not so different. So the liter of milk is cheaper than a liter of table water. I mean the costs of production are completely different. So we as the dairy sector must do something that was mentioned by our colleague from Germany. That is, we must our food, our agri-food products make more sort of, let's say, precious. And we still have competitors in the major of cases are mainly based on price. I mean, this is price competition. So it's a kind of competition involving pushing out competitors mainly by price, mainly, not necessarily, but mainly. So it's not surprising that the retailers that have a choice, they know that the three are waiting with the lower prices, three suppliers are waiting with the lower prices, and that's why the retail sector indeed in the same position, waiting for its position, then would of course choose on the basis of the shopper's selection criteria, that is the consumer who makes a choice based on price. So we are within a kind of circle that we can finish when only big players on the market start increasing their prices, but it's a bit difficult because we are a sort of cooperative market where, let's say, finally, I mean, cooperatives know that at the end of the year they have to have, let's say, zero, close to zero, because they need money for investment for other things, but they don't want to earn so much. So somehow Poland should somehow leave this kind of circle slowly. Thank you very much. Any more comments, perhaps, from the floor? So, ladies and gentlemen, let me mention some things from the practical perspective. Let me say briefly, relationships between suppliers and chains are pathological, and retail chains are pathological. Why? Because it's fiction. It is fiction. Let me repeat the word, that the suppliers negotiates an agreement with the retail chain. No, they are not negotiations, not at all. Because we go to them, we get the agreement, this is the adhesive sort of contract, prepared for everyone in the same way. There are some kind of elements. We see rebate at such and such level, or rebate at a different level. And the level of rebate is different. So one buyer says it is 40% rebate. So, well, there are some negotiations here. The other says 30%, and he's satisfied that he got 30%. And that's one issue. The other is that retail chains definitely adapt themselves very quickly, as the Madam Lawyer rightly put it, to the law on the so-called contract advantage. We've noticed that groups of lawyers work on it, how to avoid everything, how to avoid it, because they will definitely not give up what they have already obtained. They would definitely not give it up. Why should they give up? They think we got used to that already. So if indeed they kind of paint this store or do remodeling, they would not pay that you have to pay for remodeling. You kind of write it in a different way, like you must give me my rebates. So of course, if they got more rebates, they would refurbish more stores. even 20. So finally, let me put it like that. There must be regulations, legal regulations, and even as regards this contract advantage law, there must be very detailed, let's say, regulations, provisions, because in Poland there is no, let's say, kind of commercial culture. And as you put it in the past, Madam Lawyer, in the past we used to shake hands, everything was agreed on, and it was fine. But in Poland, there is a kind of tradesman culture. Who is sort of smarter, who would cheat the other one? And today then we have some examples in the press. They write that retail chains cooperate better with smaller suppliers. They started respecting smaller suppliers. Yes, because, ladies and gentlemen, the big ones, cannot be, say, treated in a different way because they are wiser, and the small ones are happy to enter the retail chains. But when they are so well trained by them that indeed in fact, Bogart, we do add money to that business. Why they are treated like that? Because the small ones are not well prepared. We need more education here. So I would recommend to you a very interesting document by Office for Consumer and Competition Protection. So thank you for that report. This is a trading report about, among other things, trading practices, and there is one provision there that OCCP addressed bigger suppliers with some questions on some issues, that is, a question about these relationships, let's say, generally. So they did not get responses from Polish suppliers because they were really afraid of that. Or, as the lady rightly put it, we want to remain anonymous, whereas this report clearly specifies that these practices are absolutely, I mean, these relationships are not partnership relationships. That's clear, and the report really unambiguously shows it. And this Hydra must have this head cut off because it's growing again and again, and it quickly adapts to the situation. Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to say something?
No cóż, ostatnia
So
refleksja.
now the last reflection.
Prawo, kolejne przepisy jak nożyce
more
ucinające
regulations, cutting like scissors the head of these practices that enforce lowering the prices, which are unbeneficial for the others. So thank you, panelists, for your professional statements and energy. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Now we have lunch break, so bon appetit. And let's get together here at 2:30 p.m. and applause for our panelists.
Dziękujemy pięknie i
Thank
życzymy
you
smacznego
so
posiłku.
much and enjoy your meal.